Have you guys ever gotten really into something that's somewhat different from the stuff that you like so far, but rather than just accepting that and moving on with your life, you develop an entire pseudo-philosophical justification for your new hyperfixation? You know, just in case someone asks. And has 80 minutes of spare time to listen to you ramble? No? Just me? Well, joke's on you because this is that ramble and you've already listened to 20 seconds of it, so I'm just gonna assume you're locked in. Oh, by the way, if you're expecting a reasonable conclusive argument with solid evidence, then you might just want to turn off this video. I mostly just plan to spew pseudo-philosophical conjectures and then give some vague abstract propositions. Got it? Great. Now let's talk about Touhou Project. I guess it's fine to start with an introduction. Touhou is a Japanese multimedia mega franchise that on every level makes no goddamn sense. Let me set the scene for you. Originally, just a series of indie games developed entirely by one mad genius, Zun, as well as a couple of spin-off manga and lore books, this small series has grown probably the most dedicated and creative fandom of all time. Now I could waste away the last of my youthful years just talking about the different types of fanwork that have been made, but suffice it to say it encompasses fan art, indie games that would be popular even on their own, fully animated OVAs, an entire subgenre of music dedicated to reworking tracks from the games, and of course, thousands and thousands of doujinshi. Okay, I should clarify this now. Doujinshi just means self-published work for people with similar interests, usually in the form of short 20 to 80 page manga, but it can also encompass games, music, animation, art books, literally anything. Despite what you've been told, it's not just hentai. Okay, there is a lot of hentai as well. Doujinshi are actually a particularly good metric because the main convention that they're sold at, Comic Head, coincidentally also the largest convention in the world, publishes statistics on which series are most represented in the fanworks sold there. In this, we can see that Touhou has comfortably remained in the top 10 ever since like 2007, even being by far the most popular franchise for about 10 years. And I'm pretty sure the only reason it isn't the most popular nowadays is because since 2004, they've hosted a separate convention, roughly a quarter of Comic Head size, exclusively dedicated to Touhou. Even without bringing this up, however, you know what Touhou is. This isn't a guess, you have seen the fan art. You have heard the names of the characters, you've almost certainly heard some of the music, even if it's just that one. If you spend any amount of time in the online anime and otaku fandoms, it can sometimes feel like no matter where you look, there's some reference to the series, some artist that got their start working on Touhou fanworks. Seeing this, it's pretty natural to wonder just what on earth this Touhou thing is, and after diligently reading the first paragraph of its Wikipedia, to wonder just how a series of small indie shoot-em-ups became so everywhere. There's obviously no single answer, however, and so to add some perspective, let me bring up Undertale for a bit. Now, I've never personally interacted with Undertale, but I did watch a Super iPatch Wolf video about it roughly 4 years ago, which is basically the same thing. In this video, he focuses not on Undertale the game, but on Undertale the fan community. To dramatically simplify, his main point is that despite Undertale's very limited runtime, almost every character that you meet has some sort of hidden depth to them, and even the minor characters go through some sort of coherent and emotional character arc, all of which the player feels invested in because of the constant moral choice of saving or killing each enemy. His ultimate point is that all of this stellar writing being compressed into such a small package created a craving among fans to see more and more of the characters, thereby incentivizing them to create fanworks on a scale most games could only dream of. I bring this up because there's a lot of obvious parallels between Touhou and Undertale, which makes sense given that Toby Fox explicitly took inspiration from Zun. Both are relatively small-scale, low-tech indie games, but which have developed a fanbase whose size and creativity is completely disproportionate to the surface-level size of the game. You would naturally expect, then, that the conclusion would be similar for Touhou, right? That the games present short but compelling stories with characters that have understandable personalities and fun dialogue, many of them also undergoing some sort of coherent character arc. At the very least, that's what I expected. But then, you actually play these legendary games, and it's just so underwhelming? Short arcade-style shoot-em-ups, a couple flat dialogue sections, and art that pales in comparison to the fan art that probably got you to play them. Let's begin by making the relatively uncontroversial assumption that writing is what gets people invested in characters. If this is the starting assumption, then these games present quite a bit of a paradox, I think. Now, I'll go on record and say that I do personally like the stories in the games, but I also can't shake the feeling that this is mostly due to my investment in the franchise as a whole. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in the literal most popular game, Touhou 6 Embodiment of Scarlet Devil. For starters, most of the story isn't even present in the actual games, but through a couple of .txt files. You get one file explaining the premise, the land has been covered in a scarlet mist, and then another document which just states a couple basic facts about the characters, most of which consist of the middest jokes you've ever heard, and or some variation of I'm totally about to crush you. You also get 1 or 2 lines right before the fight with the boss, Remelia Scarlet, explaining that she dislikes the sun and hence the mist. No interesting goals, no compelling backstory, no real messages or themes, nothing even resembling a narrative structure. Effectively, the experience of Touhou 6 is of playing a pretty decent game and then going on Wikipedia to get a bit of lore info. Touhou 8 Imperishable Night is more representative of the series as a whole, yes, and while it does do a bit more on the writing side, it fails to escape what I just described. The antagonists this time have a much more expansive backstory that is kinda interesting, but again, this barely comes up in the game itself, outside of the characters restating their motivations and that they definitely totally for real this time are going to defeat the protagonists. There isn't anything more than the most basic possible character development, and I struggle to think of a significant theme or message that the narrative communicates. The experience is still play a game and then read about the lore on the wiki. It's just that now the wiki article is longer. You're probably wondering why I'm harping on this .txt point so much, rather than criticizing the actual backstories and setting, or anything actually substantive, but that's mostly because I don't actually have much of a problem with any of that. I mean, yes, most of the character backstories are about as substantive as that of an average isekai harem girl, but looking at it another way, that's also entirely to be expected. Zun originally just made these games as fun passion projects, games meant to present his music and appeal to shoot-'em-up fans. On that criteria, they actually mostly succeed. The shoot-'em-up gameplay is challenging, yes, but never once feels unfair, and importantly, it's filled with 1,000 little moments of catharsis as you dodge through beautiful patterns in rough beat with the absolutely top-tier soundtrack. If anything, I'm the asshole here for trying to judge it on a criteria that the games were never striving for. Actually, on the topic of gameplay, I'd like to call this the main appeal, as indeed I just tried to, but I should probably address the elephant in the room first. Namely, who the fuck in the 21st century calls themselves a shoot-'em-up fan? Solid as it may be, does it not strike anyone else a bit weird that a series this popular is built in a genre that literally no one plays anymore? But then, this right here is the core problem, isn't it? Because when you actually look at the current state of the franchise, you swiftly realize that the games are as much of a concern for the average fan as the ending theme of their third favorite seasonal anime. The annual Touhou popularity poll, a questionnaire that by definition only heavily invested Touhou fans would even answer, directly asks its respondents what they like about Touhou. In the 2025 poll, even though multiple answers were possible, and so in theory you could circle every answer just to show support, only 63% of people said that the games were what they liked about Touhou, making it the second least popular answer after fandom. Music, characters, fanworks, lore, even story all scored significantly higher. This is reflected in the rest of the responses as well. The survey is divided into characters, music, and work sections, the former having nearly twice as many responses as each of the others, and for every single mainline game, by far the most common response to the question of what difficulty have you cleared this game at was not played. This number is above 50% for all but the most popular games, and even for those is above 40%. Keep in mind, this is 40 to 50% among only about 1/6 of respondents who even bothered to respond to these questions, and didn't just do the survey to vote for their favorite characters. Man, the more I look at this poll, the more evidence I find of the game's unimportance. Like here, when the poll asks what Touhou-related things the respondent has done since last time. Leaving behind that, again, only a bit over a fifth of total respondents even responded to this, the number of fans of this supposedly game-centric franchise that, quote, played the official games in the past year was only about 61%, making it the third most popular option behind looked at illustrations and listened to arrangements, and only just barely above read the official printworks and read doujin works, 59% and 57% respectively. I could go on, but honestly, I just wanted to attach some numbers to something that anyone with even a passing acquaintance in Touhou could have told you. Even if it stems from a series of games, Touhou nowadays is mostly a collection of popular characters and soundtracks, and the experience of being a Touhou fan is primarily about listening to arrangements and looking at illustrations. It appears to be a fandom in which the actual mainline games are on roughly the same level as the printworks, the fan-made mobile games, and the fan-made doujinshi. And if you consider that doujin games and videos were counted separately, the games might even be slightly lower in the hierarchy. Let's take a step back and acknowledge that this is weird, right? There exists an implied hierarchy that most franchises are built around. An original work is created, develops a fanbase, the original creator releases side content, and a portion of fans create their own derivative works. The implicit assumption here is that the original work is the, quote, real content, the core piece of media that any fan should cross before being able to enjoy the secondary content, consisting of official spin-offs and fan work. Touhou, it seems, has completely turned this hierarchy on its head, and created a state where fan works are the primary content. Hell, given my points about the writing of the games and how few other successful shoot-'em-ups exist nowadays, I wouldn't be surprised if a large portion of fans only played the original games because of their investment in the franchise as a whole. For the series to reach this state, where the characters have transcended their original games, and where fanworks are more important than the original games themselves, you would expect that the original games have absolute masterpiece levels of character writing. This is why I emphasize the .txt files and the lack of narrative so heavily. Even if they contained paragraphs and paragraphs of nuanced character descriptions and backstories that somehow described coherent and compelling arcs, it still would not explain this level of popularity. To understand why though, I'd like to digress for a bit and explain the mechanics of how someone actually becomes a fan of something. To set a baseline, I think we can all agree that reading a plot summary on Wikipedia is not a good substitute for actually playing a game and experiencing its story, right? Even if the summary is detailed enough that it conveys all the necessary information, it doesn't do anything to actually make the reader give a shit about it. I'm a firm believer that the human brain is not particularly good at separating fiction from reality. If it was, you would never cry or care about what is in effect nothing more than a collection of pixels. This is why you need to actually experience a story for yourself, because it is precisely by seeing and processing the way that a character acts, speaks, and makes decisions in the story that your subconscious can be tricked into viewing them as a person. In well-written and directed stories, there's also 1,000 little moments and character interactions that tell your subconscious who this character is, that help your brain build a subjective understanding of them through its own interpretation. This is what I call having emotional investment in a series or a character. And when you are emotionally invested in something, to the point that you are curious about and want to find more of it, you become a fan. The actual factual information conveyed in the Touhou games is fine. In fact, most of the lore and character backstories are, in my opinion, very interesting. The problem that I have with the Touhou games is that because of the way they are presented, because the only time you actually see the characters is in brief, awkward dialogue exchanges, most of which are just them flatly stating their motivation, I don't accept the argument that the writing in these games adequately builds the necessary emotional investment to incentivize this level of fan creation. That right there is the core, actually. I would completely understand if this was a small series with a niche but dedicated following. But the Touhou fandom is one of the biggest and most dedicated in all of gaming. A degree of popularity which I hope I've demonstrated does not square with the games it allegedly comes from. I hope you can start to see what I mean when I say that this franchise makes no goddamn sense. The Undertale fanbase may be huge, but even looking at it from my admittedly outsider perspective, it very much seems like no matter how far some fanworks may strive from the original game, the fundamental investment that its creators and readers have for the characters can be traced to the solid writing and hidden depth of the original game. In other words, you can very easily view even the most outlandish fanworks as some extension of the original games. This cannot be said for Touhou. Looking at Touhou from the outside, you would be forced to conclude that millions of people got, and continue to get, really invested in a series of indie games with no real narratives, character writing that is at best conceptually interesting, art that varies from ugly to niche, and are also made in a genre that I guarantee the vast majority of fans don't actually have an interest in. Not only that, but they've apparently grown such an attachment to these games that they've spent their lives building the fandom equivalent of the Library of Alexandria, which in contrast to the most fundamental conception of media, has become the primary way that new fans interact with the franchise. And yet despite this, I don't believe anything becomes popular purely due to luck. Nor do I like to discount ways of enjoyment as illegitimate, especially if it's something that I participate in. Clearly, this is a thing that people like and that people can consider themselves fans of. It just exists in a state so far removed from the typical view of media that it becomes impossible to talk about. In short, there doesn't yet exist the proper vocabulary to discuss Touhou. So let's start there. Before we can even talk about what makes Touhou popular, we have to establish just what the fuck Touhou actually is. What I'm going to propose is that the Touhou project be conceptualized not as a series of games, nor as a mere franchise, nor even as a subgenre, but rather as a database. I know this sounds weird now, but believe it or not, I've got actual academic journalism citing here. Let's get into it. In the early 2000s, culture critic and philosopher Azuma Hiroki noticed that a shift had taken place in the fundamental way that Japanese audiences, particularly those in the new otaku subculture, consumed and processed media. Now this isn't some boring observation like fans began to converge online or something, but a much more fundamental psychic shift that had occurred among both creators and consumers alike. Unlike in the 80s, where the point of watching each of the hundreds of Gundam anime was to gain more and more pieces of its overarching grand narrative, in a process that the critic Otsuka Eiji titled narrative consumption, the way fans reacted to anime like Evangelion was to get attached to characters individually. Despite how expansive the Evangelion storyline is across its many works, fanworks from the time focused almost entirely on its characters, mostly the girls, in small, localized narratives. the focus being on their interactions and how cute they inherently are, rather than on whatever the plot was rambling about at that point. In the years following, something even more interesting happened. Otaku became fans not just of individual characters, but of specific character traits, stuff like maids or nekomimi, with many of the most popular characters of that era, and even nowadays to an extent, achieving their popularity by basically combining all of the most popular traits. This is the crux of what he titled database consumption. According to Azuma, you can conceptualize the entirety of otaku-oriented media as being derived from one grand database. Tsundere, maids, cat ears, incurable disease, all of these would constitute entries in the database. They are traits that in and of themselves, even when detached from whatever story they appear in, people would say that they like. You can then think of the resulting media landscape as a computer. Individual works and series are but the surface graphical layer, the stuff that you see on the screen. The inner programming, the stuff that actually produces what you see, that is the database. Obviously, no such database actually exists anywhere. What Azuma is referring to is more of a shared body of knowledge. Nonetheless, the theory essentially states that otaku media is created with this database at the forefront. When creating a work for these audiences, creators pull elements that they like from the database, mold them together to define their characters and key moments, and then tie them together with a narrative that conveys the themes they want, and importantly, justifies those chosen elements. Similarly, when otaku consume a work, they aren't doing so in isolation. Something like an anime is not consumed as an individual story that happens to draw on common tropes. It is consumed with the explicit intention to experience those elements that the otaku likes. Azuma, I would say a bit harshly, describes this as similar to a drug. The consumer craves manifestations of the elements that appeal to them, and so seeks out works that depict them. Hearing all this, you are probably thinking, what on earth does this have to do with Touhou project? Truthfully, probably not a crazy amount, but I'm a big fan of the framework, so let's have some fun with it. First, let's recall what I talked about earlier. Touhou is a franchise that completely does away with the typical hierarchy of media. The way fans interact with it does not follow the pattern of experience the main work, seek side content for more. Going back to the popularity poll, it becomes clear that Touhou nowadays is chiefly a collection of characters and music. For the average Touhou fan, the fan content, whether that be arrangements of songs, illustrations, games, or doujinshi, are the main appeal. What I want to do then is propose a perspective that frames this as a feature, not a bug. The challenge with that, however, is to somehow conceptualize Touhou in a way that can both encapsulate all forms of media related to it and somehow consider them all equally valid. Therefore, I propose that something like Touhou is not a series of games, a collection of fanworks, or anything as physical as that. Instead, in the same way that you can imagine the existence of an overall otaku database which stems from and creates works within the otaku sphere, I propose that Touhou itself has become a database. And when people say that they like Touhou, they aren't talking about the games, they mean that by and large, they have experienced and like those underlying characters and concepts. The games and fanworks are a part of Touhou for sure, but they are simply manifestations of the series' true form, a database. Now you're probably thinking that this sounds completely abstract and like meaningless semantics, but let's think about it for a second. Hakure Reimu, the traditional protagonist of Touhou, is a character. We can all agree on that. But let me ask, what story is the character in? What work is she from? The first instinct is to say the games, of course, but is that really the case? We have established that the average fan's experience with Reimu will probably come mostly from fanworks. And while the core of her character remains consistent, the details of her personality and relationships naturally change depending on the creator. Even if they mostly experience her character through non-narrative means such as fan art or arrangements, are you seriously going to tell me that every fan artist is inspired purely by the original games? Hell, I can bring up cases where that very much is not the case. As I discussed earlier, the human brain is not perfectly capable of separating fiction from reality. If it could, you would never have an emotional reaction to stories that aren't real. As such, I seriously doubt it's capable of fully compartmentalizing Reimu in canon versus Reimu in fanon. Every piece of media that a fan interacts with thus influences their views on that character, whether official or not. I understand the temptation to claim that the games are the core of the franchise, that as the origin point, every piece of fan media, even if mostly influenced by other fan media, that were themselves influenced by other fan media, should still be viewed as derivative of the original games. Now, while this is technically the case, and I would never advocate that you should disregard Zun's role or the fanware guidelines he set out, Based on everything I've seen, I just don't think that speaking or thinking about Touhou in that way adequately reflects the average experience and intentions of most fans and creators. To reflect that experience then, I believe we should conceptualize Reimu not as a character in the Touhou games, but as a character in the overall Touhou database. In other words, what I'm saying is that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. If Touhou nowadays is treated by its fans as an abstract collection of characters and settings, where the fan works it produces are as important to fans as the original games, then we should talk about it as such. I'm just trying to give this collection a fancy label. I think the core barrier most people have to framing Touhou as one singular overarching entity is that there's no possible way to unify every work made. Almost inherently, there are conflicting stories and character personalities in different people's interpretations. All of this is resolved, however, when you view the fan's behavior as an extension of the database theory. See, I didn't just introduce this to steal its name. Oh no, I'm butchering this theory in more ways than you could imagine. If what fans crave when they consume Touhou-related content is a chance to experience these characters, settings, and interpretations, to view a physical manifestation of something that they inherently like, then who cares if there's no unifying narrative, or if individual works contradict each other? Each work, whether fan-made or official, still fulfills this craving. In much the same way that someone can say they like quote-unquote anime, rather than just listing some individual works that appeal to them, I posit that because of the state the franchise currently exists in, it is perfectly possible for someone to say that they like Touhou the concept or Touhou the database, without necessarily referring to any particular work. In fact, this is something that people do already. The only point that I'm trying to make is that the only world in which it makes sense to proclaim that you like Touhou instead of the Touhou games is one in which you fully break away from viewing the franchise as subservient to games that are only somewhat connected to what people like. From there, you can just apply Azuma's database theory. Once you grow a fondness for this database, you develop a craving, an addiction, if you will, to seeing it actualized. You read more and more doujins, play the games to completion, spend hours exploring new songs, not just because these individual pieces of media are good, but because in some way they are the manifestations and products of the database that you've grown to love. The reason I feel comfortable making this sort of distinction is because Touhou actually isn't the only series that I would describe in this way. Privately, I've been using the term database franchise to the utter bemusement of my friends, and indeed will continue to use this term for the rest of this video. Kancolle is I think the most directly comparable example. As a Japan-locked browser game with quite literally zero story, that nonetheless became the largest series at Comic Head for 4 years straight, and nowadays mostly survives as a collection of doujinshi and live events. Even series like Uma Musume that have strong official works at the core of their extended franchise could still be classified as database franchises. Even if you don't care about any of the fan works, which as one of the largest franchises at Comic Head there are a lot of, the stories of each Uma are still divided among the anime, mobile game, and if you're willing to venture that far, the side manga. This is even more pronounced in series like Love Live, where now you experience the characters in a direct way through the anime and games, and in a more abstract way through the music. Also, I should probably have clarified this earlier. I know that because of the theory's notoriety and not so subtle implication that otaku are mindless animals who crave nothing more than meaningless gratification, some people might think I'm belittling these franchises. I'm not. I'm actually a very big fan of all of them. I just thought the theory was applicable in explaining their modern incarnations. With that being said, this is a neat idea and all, but there is one pretty big flaw to it. I mentioned that different works manifest characters and concepts that fans inherently like, but conveniently brushed over just how the fuck someone is able to inherently like a character that, based on my description, isn't even really a character by most standards. This holds as much true for nowadays as when Touhou came out, back when it really was just a standalone series of games. I know quality and popularity aren't perfectly correlated, but people don't just start creating fanworks for media they feel nothing about. What this means is that for all my criticisms of Touhou's writing, there has to be some element somewhere in these games that allows people to like the characters and that has somehow branched out and transcended the original games. Well, big surprise, I do have an answer to this, and believe it or not, it's much more obvious than I'm letting on because it's the only element that I haven't fully addressed yet. One of Zun's most famous quotes is where he semi-jokes that the entire Touhou series of games is actually just a vessel for him to release his music. The point I'm going to make in this section is that once you accept music as the central element of Touhou, every query that I had about its popularity all but vanish. That being said, this goes way beyond the music is good. And so I'd like to illustrate by looking at an admittedly somewhat extreme example, Flanders Scarlet. Flandre is a character that appeared in one game in 2002, was completely absent from any Touhou media until 2019, and has never once been given anything resembling a backstory or motivations. And yet, she has consistently been one of the top 3 most popular characters in the ranking since her debut. I talked about Touhou 6 in the introduction, and by God, Flandre is the perfect microcosm of how that game tackles writing. From the game itself, we know that she is the little sister of the main boss, Scarlet, and that she hasn't left her mansion's basement for about 495 years, except that one time where I guess the rain stopped her. If I'm feeling charitable, I could say that despite the awkward dialogue, you do get a bit of a sense that she's easily excited and maybe a little childish. Oh yeah, and she really likes Danmaku, and as the extra stage boss is really strong. Moving on to the almighty .txt, you also learn that her power is to destroy anything. Like literally anything. This fucking series, man. Oh yeah, and the rain was actually created by Patchouli specifically to keep her in the mansion. Now, I was very harsh in the beginning, so let's actually be fair to Zun and say that this is fine. It's not nothing. In fact, it's enough that you can start theorizing a bit about her. For example, if we know that she hasn't left the basement for 495 years, you can maybe assume that this isn't the first time the others have prevented her from leaving. If you also think about how she's kinda childish and apparently wields the power of an angry god, you could maybe headcanon that they don't want her to leave because of how dangerous her powers are. Now, if I were to put on my pretentious video essayist hat that I received complimentary after I so shamelessly butchered that database theory, I could state that in reality it could be any number of explanations. You can make theories about quite literally anything, and it's not that difficult to just come up with 5 somewhat connected pieces of information and leave the fans to do the heavy lifting. So I guess it's a damn good thing that's not what I'm going to do, because apparently that's exactly what happened about 1,000 times over. One of the most common fan interpretations of Flandre is that of the psychopath. The degree varies, but very often, especially in older works, she is basically depicted as a murderous weapon of mass destruction. Someone who revels in killing and hurting others, and has been locked in the basement out of fear of what would happen if she's released. At the complete other end of the spectrum, however, some works depict her almost entirely as a cute and childish little sister character, with her strength only occasionally manifesting in her accidentally destroying something. In between these two, there are about 1 million subtly yet meaningfully different interpretations built from this core concept. Some of the darker interpretations depict her as an almost tragically innocent character, who hurts others not because she's evil, but because she's a child and doesn't know any better. Other times, she's a generally sweet and kind-hearted character, who nonetheless loves to fight and only occasionally loses her mind. You can sort of see how these interpretations connect to the information that I've given, but the question that I always return to is, why? Why would anyone bother to do this? Why was anyone drawn to this character in the first place? If she was one mysterious character in an otherwise fleshed out story, I could totally understand it, but as I said, this standard of writing is the same for every character in the game. Is it the design? I mean, sure, the concept is cool and I'm sure that played some role, but something tells me that's not the full story either. You can claim that memes and popularity play a role, and while that's part of it, I find it difficult to imagine that thousands of creators would spend time producing works for a character that they don't have any emotional investment in. And so we're back where we started. Flandre is one of the most popular characters in all of gaming, with a plethora of interpretations stemming from her pretty bare-bones bio, despite having almost no screen time and no compelling backstory, motivations, or really any actual character to speak of. What she does have, however, is one of the singularly most iconic soundtracks in all of gaming. If you've heard any track from Touhou that isn't Bad Apple, it's probably Flandre's theme You and Owen Was Her. Beyond it simply being a crazy fun song to listen to, what I find most interesting about it is how every little element of intuitive characterization I listed earlier is expressed in this song. The song opens with a chaotic spiral, each subsection accented by 3 repeating high-pitched notes, immediately creating a sense of confusion and panic. This is extra effective because rather than slowly building into it in a dramatic fashion, it just cuts right in, creating the sense that you've suddenly been dropped into a cage with a dangerous predator. With this, the first impression that you get of Flandre is that she's strong, yes, but more clearly that she's a threat. The effect is even more pronounced in the game, where it contrasts heavily with her childish dialogue and bright character design, but also feels fitting given that you're starting what is the final battle of the game. The next 2 sections will both feature the same now iconic chord progression. In its first loop, it feels vaguely upbeat, but also pretty restrained, and the low tones and drop in pace give it an undeniably ominous vibe, all the while a second, more intense melody slowly but surely builds in the background. This culminates in the next section, which is simultaneously a more cheerful version of the previous one, but now also sounds unmistakably wrong and uncanny, almost like a corrupted version of a children's song. I particularly like how these two sections end with a small yet noticeable drop, which just accentuates the wrongness. This section lasts just a bit longer than the intro, and given how unusual the first section is, creates just a bit of mental reprieve. It feels like the fog of the intro has lifted and you're now starting to get a glimpse of Flandre herself. The upbeat vibe and overarching childlike melody feel like they fit with everything you've seen about her until now, but alongside that, there's also something else as well. You start to feel like alongside the childish mannerisms hides something darker. This is, however, yet again contrasted by the chorus, which now just sounds cheerful. It's almost completely lacking in the previous uncanny elements, and while it's definitely intense and chaotic, it mostly just feels, for lack of a better word, fun. This section is also 3 times as long as the previous one, so the positivity almost begins to wash over the uncanny chaos. Right as you begin to relax, however, it cuts to the bridge, and you begin to feel tense as the positive vibes are replaced with a slow and ominous tune, subtly building tension, just in case you forgot this was a boss. However, even this, the song's most standard sounding section, quickly turns playful, the ominous tension-building notes being reconstructed to fit the main beat, in a way that feels like an experienced classical pianist decided to just fuck around with his keyboard. From here on, the song maintains this image that the tense feeling is being toyed with. The next section is essentially a remix of section 2, and while it keeps the ominous sounding notes, and the section afterwards will see a return of the uncanny performance of section 3, it sprinkles in some very light jazz. It sounds like the trumpeteers in the fiendish orchestra that performed the first few sections suddenly gained free will and just decided to vibe with their instruments. The ominous background track now replaced with a low-key yet upbeat melody. This continues until we reach the chorus, which now sounds even more joyous and whimsical than the first time round. The vibe that you're left with here is not a childish and innocent song corrupted and twisted into something evil, but rather a chaotic and uncanny presence being toyed with and manipulated into something positive, joyful, and even more chaotic, while still maintaining that sense that something is ever so slightly wrong, and if you make the wrong move, you could end up in a lot of trouble. Or, to rephrase that in the context of this being a song for the character Flandre Scarlet, you could say that this isn't a case of darkness hiding behind what appears to be a cute lolly. Instead, her ominous and fun-loving nature feel inextricably tied together as one element, and you could even get a sense that she's in complete control of each side of herself. I should also emphasize that each section is like 10 seconds max, so even on the macro scale the song feels scattered, the impression it gives changing before it can be fully processed. Notice how all of these impressions that I've listed, the sense of panic when encountering her strength, the drifting between the childlike and dark facets of her personality, the sense that these elements are inextricably tied together rather than two separate sides of her, even the overall sense of upbeat fun, all of these feel in some way connected to the hard information that the game presents you with, albeit vaguely. You get the sense that she's a childlike character with some inherent darkness, but what actually is that darkness? There really isn't any answer to this given the information so far, other than just the ever-vague insanity excuse. At this stage, however, in the context of a game that ultimately isn't super narrative focused, that's probably fine. The role of the music here is to provide a bridge between the hard information presented in the series and the viewer's emotional investment, to establish a core intuitive sense of who she is, and to give some actual flavor to what is nothing more than a paragraph of dry text. I would argue that this is the key to everything, because it is by giving you this intuitive sense, and by tying the character to a song that not only feels like it fits, but is also just a good-ass piece of music, that the series gives you the opportunity to actually like the character, despite the fact that there really isn't that much to her writing. That being said, this is really only enough in the context of her original game. If you want to actually tell a story with her, you will need to imagine a couple more pieces of hard information. And imagine people did. What is the darkness within her? Well, some creators would say it's a rage against her sister and the world, spurred on by being sealed away for so long. Others have depicted it as a fundamental lack of moral grounding, potentially due to her lack of maturity. For others, this internal darkness just means that she really likes a good fight, whereas to some, she is a fundamentally psychopathic character who revels in murdering those around her. Hell, I'll go further. You'll notice that in most interpretations, her psychopathic and childlike nature are intrinsically linked. Oftentimes, the sense that there's something wrong with her, or that she has this slightly uncanny vibe, is a direct result of her childish nature. In other works, her childish side and lack of morality have a common cause in the centuries she spent alone in the basement. One of my personal favorite interpretations is when she means well, but ends up accidentally hurting people due to her inherently high strength. I emphasize in the song analysis that the childish and dark elements feel linked. This isn't a childish character hiding some inner evil, it's a character who embodies both as a singular whole. What I'm trying to convey is that even this nuance is preserved across the majority of the fanworks that I've seen. In fact, even on a meta level, a lot of the works I've seen from Flandre end up mirroring the structure of the song. You're introduced to her as a threat, often with another character suddenly being dropped in front of her. As it goes on, you see more glimpses of her sweet and childlike side, but still the darker elements of her never quite go away. I'm ready to accept that this is nothing more than an over-analytical rambling with the benefit of hindsight. Regardless, I hope that I've shown that you can trace a line from her common interpretations through the interpretation of her theme that I've laid out, all the way to her original bio. I hope to demonstrate that in some subconscious way, not only does the vibe set by the original song still impact her perception today, but that there exists a sense of unity between every single interpretation of her and her original description, solidified and tied together by this theme music. Okay, at this point, you should ideally start to see how Touhou provides the perfect breeding ground for a universe of fanworks, but something tells me you're not fully convinced yet. That's fine, this is all pretty abstract after all. Plus, these elements are cool and all, but surely having a well-written and thought-out character is better for longevity, right? Well, here's the thing. That would be the case if Flandre was just a fluke, but this is the experience that you get for almost every character in the series. Kogasa, for example, is a yokai who tries desperately to scare people, but always fails because she's more on the cute and funny side of the spectrum than the scary boss monster side. Reflecting this is her theme, which is largely composed of deep and ominous beats, but has them jump around in a way that's both playful and melancholic. It climbs high on the bridge, only for the chorus to be a slow descent into depression. Listening to the song, you can almost hear her energetically complaining about a failed scare, getting excited for another, only for it to fail again. Even in cases like Fujiwara no Moko, where the character has a pretty developed backstory and whose personality varies significantly less than Flandre, I'd still argue that the theme music is the crucial last element that makes them truly engaging. Her backstory, one about spending a millennia in increasingly painful isolation after drinking the elixir of immortality, may be detailed, but unless you read Cajun Lunatic Renegade, which I guarantee nobody but me has, it's still just a .txt. It's still just facts coldly presented to fill gaps in the story for people who are kinda curious about who that last boss was. It's when this story is combined with her music that we can actually feel something. Her theme song, Reach for the Moon, starts off somber and reflective, only to have this section repeated almost note for note throughout the song, each time getting faster, louder, and more disorganized, until it almost feels like the song is screaming at you. It is the sound of someone who foolishly accepted immortality during a vulnerable state, the centuries of repetition they survived, and their heart crying out for some sort of escape, ending with a somber acceptance of that repeating fate. Even if you don't immediately interpret it this deeply, the somber opening getting distorted throughout the song, the intense interludes, the contrast between the melancholic and intense sections, all of this creates an image in your mind that attaches itself to your perception of Moko, providing that extra emotional layer to actually like her as a character. This is what I've decided to call vibes-based characterization, where a character is defined not just by their factual information, but by an overarching intuitive vibe. So far, I've just been talking about the characters, but even the setting of Gensokyo is given such a vibrant character through its sheer quantity of songs which communicate the vibe of each different location. You have tracks like Fall of Fall or Lullaby of a Deserted Hell, which convey the feel of very specific areas of the world, a grand yet refreshing waterfall in the former, and an abandoned yet still living underworld in the latter. Point is, it's not just that you and Owen makes you feel the main elements of Flandre, it's that it does this within a world that already feels like a second home. I really want to emphasize here that I do not think the music is some magical gift from heaven that instantly adds depth to every aspect of the series. Really, all I'm arguing for here is that this provides that one extra push. It adds that extra little bit of life to a series with high potential but little narrative. The initial spark, if you will, that ignited the community's passion for the franchise. I likewise cannot shake the idea that the reason why Touhou and characters like Flandre have survived for this long is because you connect each element to a piece of music that backs up everything you were told about it. If nothing else, it at least helps it stick in your mind a little bit longer. To go back to my foolproof model of emotional investment, the game's writing may give you the hard information about a character, but by having this expressed through the music that plays during the stages, your brain is finally able to actually feel something about it. Now, here's where I get to put on my mad scientist hat and start combining my little theories together, and I'll do so by briefly tackling one particularly odd facet of the fandom. You'll recall a couple paragraphs ago, I claimed that from a pure writing perspective, the games give you roughly the same emotional investment as reading their wiki page. This wording was very deliberate. One peculiarity of the Touhou fandom is that if you want to get into it but don't necessarily have an interest in shoot-'em-up games, a surprisingly accepted practice is to just skip the games and read the wiki summaries. I've seen people recommend this practice, hell, I've done this myself. I'm a huge fan of Hata no Kokoro, for example, but you could not pay me to sit down and actually play a fighting game, which means that I cannot ever interact with her in the only game she actually appears in. I originally explained this away by showing that the original games are basically the same as a wiki article anyway in terms of their writing, but now I've just spent 10 minutes justifying why actually the games are necessary to gain this investment in the characters. So what gives? Well, here's where all the pieces finally connect. Originally, yes, I'm sure you probably did need to go through the games to get into Touhou, but we now live in a world 25 years separated from the first relevant games. The hierarchy has been dismantled. The Touhou games developed by Zun have long since been subsumed by the overall Touhou database. Yeah, remember when I talked about that some 30 minutes ago? Whereas originally, you would get the sense of Flandre from her stage and theme song, there now exist thousands of songs based on this theme, each of which convey a slightly different aspect of her vibe. There likewise exist innumerable pieces of fan art, doujinshi, and fangames that all pull from this new database. The key point to take away from my vibes-based characterization ramble is that even in the original games, Touhou characters were always, to an extent, defined by the vague impression that their theme song gave you. What this means then, is that in conjunction with the ocean of Touhou content, is that unlike games that sell you on their characters through a narrative, you don't need to play the original games to get that investment. The hard information about who the characters are can be just as easily gained from the wiki, or from general osmosis. The emotional investment that would originally come from the fusion of music and characters in the games can likewise be gained from any combination of external music, fan art, doujinshi, anything. Because the unifying and defining element of the characters is their backstory and vibe, rather than specific personality and narrative involvement, fanworks are free to break large parts of canon and still have their characters be read as the characters. And so with this, I think we finally have a proper vocabulary to discuss the Touhou project. Zun created a series of shoot-'em-up games that intentionally or not, created characters who are largely defined by the vibe of their soundtrack and some bits of external lore information. The proficiency with which the character's, for lack of a better term, character, is expressed and contained within their respective tracks incentivizes people to create their own interpretations of the characters, and the fact that they are defined by elements outside of a single narrative means that they can get as creative as they want, while still having the result be generally read as consistent. This proliferation of fanworks has led to the modern state of the franchise, one that is best described as a database of characters, settings, concepts, and interpretations, a database that creators pull from to create their own localized stories, and which fans consume to fulfill their desire to see characters that they inherently like manifested in physical form. And the reason that they have an inherent like for the characters, that remains even in completely different interpretations, lies in the vibes-based way that the characters and setting are characterized in the first place. I stress that this isn't the only valid way to like Touhou. You can be a fan of the original games and like them for what they are, but I think it's undeniable that for a lot of people, the appeal of Touhou lies in the greater database and the empire of fanworks it has enabled. This means that if someone says that they like Touhou but haven't played the games, they aren't LARPing, they're just engaging with the full extent of the franchise as it exists today. Coincidentally, while I was somewhere between the 5th and 6th revision of this script, Twitter exploded in one of those site-wide discourses it has every week about whether you should have to play the original game in order to be considered part of its fandom. To be clear, I think that in 90% of cases, yes, you should at least give the original games a fair shot before declaring yourself a fan of something. This isn't because of some righteous, thou must respect the original author's intent type argument, but simply because for the vast majority of series, there's not really any other way to build up the same level of emotional investment. The remaining 10% are series like Touhou and Kancolle, in which not only are the original games relatively bare bones by most standards, not only does there exist a critical mass of side and fan content, but where a good chunk of the appeal of the originals is due to some external vibes-based factor. If you've listened to me ramble for this long, you're either wondering what the fuck the point of all of this is, or you're not paying full attention. I name-dropped the concept of database franchises earlier, and I do stand by the idea that other series can be put into the same broad category as Touhou, and that encourage the same form of engagement as it. I mentioned that Kancolle is the second series to come to mind when I think of the concept, and it even makes use of a form of vibes-based characterization by tying all of its characters to real-life warships, a strategy later butchered by Azur Lane, and then revived by Uma Musume. There's a unique intrigue you develop for characters like Johnstern or Haru Urara when you understand the real-life counterpart that they're based on. As for the other series I named, Love Live does a lot of this subconscious character building by the songs each character produces, not to mention the connection you build with them when you engage with a character as both a character and as an artist. Even gacha games like Blue Archive have a degree of vibe building in elements like the now mandatory cafe sections and the victory poses, little details that sell otherwise largely flat characters. I like to think that if you're as invested in these kinds of franchises as I am, you can at the very least get where I'm coming from. But I also have to imagine that if you're looking at this from the outside, it probably sounds like complete and utter bullshit. To bring it back to Touhou, you can maybe accept that the music does a good job of elevating the characters in the original games, but the idea that the modern franchise is a database built on a shared vibe of who the characters are might just be a step too far. After all, there is no way for a singular person to consume every single piece of Touhou-inspired media out there, nor would someone even enjoy doing that. This isn't like Gundam where you will eventually pick up all the pieces of the grand narrative. Not to mention, even the best Touhou fanworks are ultimately made for people who know and want to experience another piece of Touhou, and so don't work super well outside of the context of database enjoyment. The consumer is thus neither piecing together some great puzzle, nor simply consuming well-made media. So what are you actually doing? Well, you're definitely piecing together some kind of puzzle. It's just one that you are also inventing yourself. For this bit, I want to focus it on the concept of getting into Touhou. I say Touhou, but as with everything so far, it applies to all database franchises. If you spend any time in places like the Touhou subreddit or Touhou Twitter, you will inevitably find people asking what Touhou is and how to get into it. Hell, even I made a post like this many years back. The most popular Touhou videos on YouTube are literally beginner guides to the franchise. Usually missing from these discussions, however, is an explanation of what it actually means to get into Touhou. As you can hopefully tell from my explanations, it's not enough to just play some of the games. Even if you can get a vague intuitive sense of flandery from the games, it very much helps to see that explored and given form. If you want to get to the point where she sticks in your mind and where you can consider yourself a fan of her, what you need is a critical mass of exposure. Let me quickly circle back to something I talked about earlier. The human brain is not perfectly capable of separating fiction from reality. If it could, you would never have an emotional reaction to stories that aren't real. Your perception is everything. Without getting too deep into the concept of bounded rationality, this is the idea I want you to keep in mind. The funny thing about getting into a database franchise is that while you choose what to consume, you can't control what your brain perceives. Your brain is, in fact, constantly trying to make sense of the world, recognizing patterns, making associations, and building an understanding of what it experiences. Every work that you consume is ultimately just more information for your brain, which takes it as input and tries to associate it with everything you already know about the other related works. The output of this process is what I like to call the world inside your mind. Getting into Touhou really is just about building up this critical mass of information. The vibes of a character can be felt throughout all derivative media, if only by association. This means that the further you explore Touhou media, the more you see Flandre in her different interpretations, the better your mental image of her. This is why getting into Touhou is rarely an overnight fall down the rabbit hole. It usually comes from a long process of being exposed to multiple facets of it, until you have that critical mass of information about the characters, setting, and themes to actually start to like it. This sounds abstract, but really I'm just describing the process by which your brain combines a bunch of different related works to try and form an overall understanding. Once this becomes developed enough, it becomes the world inside your mind. By consuming more and more works, you not only expand this world, but actualize it. You grow to love the versions of each character in your head, and now want nothing more than to see them actualized, physically manifested. The database is a drug, remember? From here, you can either embark on a journey through all kinds of works and interpretations, or, as many have evidently done, make your own. This is why I like database franchises, because it's fun to travel to another world. Okay, maybe it is a bit abstract. The more I endlessly stew on this concept, however, the less I'm convinced that it's exclusive to database franchises. You don't have to look much further than Eren Yeager and the many debates about his character to see that views on a character aren't universal. There exist in effect two overarching interpretations of Eren Yeager, which to avoid spoilers I will simplify as good or bad person. If you are a fan of Attack on Titan and believe that Eren Yeager is a good person, you're a fan of a version of the story in which the protagonist is a hero, misunderstood by people around him, and ready to embark on the ultimate self-sacrifice. If, however, you believe that Eren is a bad person, well, then you're a fan of a story of a bright-eyed naive kid who gets twisted by the crushing reality of his circumstances, and embarks on a misguided path that will see him commit the worst crimes known to man unless his former friends are able to stop him. Separating these views from their original context reveals that different people are in fact consuming two very different series, and at a base level, most people would agree that two series, one with a heroic protagonist and one with a villainous protagonist, should be judged on completely different axes. Or how about the phenomenon of shipping? This exists for normal series too. I know that most shippers don't actually believe that their ships are canon, but they come about because of some connection that their shipper has made from the original series. It is inherently informed by and based on their views of the character, and the potential dynamic is an important component of why people like certain series. I think most people, even the ones that don't spend 5 hours a day alone in their rooms pondering the philosophical implications of the murder lolly, would agree that humans ultimately don't experience anything outside their own perception. Put a gun to their head and most would probably also concede that this goes for media as well. Ultimately, when you give an opinion on something, you are giving an opinion on your perception of a series that exists in your mind. Yeah, it turns out this is my final point. Database franchises may provide a unique experience in how they are consumed, but the underlying mechanisms are the same as every piece of media. Every piece of narrative, and hell even non-narrative media work this way. They create a world inside your head, a combination of the impressions you've gotten about the characters and setting, interspersed with your own mental models and taste. The difference is really just the methods, and how much agency the individual consumer has. A normal series directly injects much of this perception in your mind via the tool of linear story, whereas a database franchise leaves you to wander laterally and pick up the pieces yourself. Hell, the vibes-based characterization I talked about earlier extends to these as well, and not just to games. What, did you think visuals and music are just pretty decorations? Listen, if you haven't personally analyzed the critical role that the different walking styles of the girls in K-On! Provide in establishing their characters, I'm afraid I cannot possibly take your opinion seriously. In trying to figure out how to conclude this, I find myself growing closer to the idea that ultimately, for as cringe as it sounds, it probably isn't possible to critically analyze why an audience likes a character. So often I'll see a review of a series that's like, Character X is really well written, in their past Y happened, and as such they begin as A, but over the story they develop into B, in line with theme alpha and message beta. And every time I hear that, I just feel my eyes grow heavy as my soul and the very concept of joy is torn from my flesh. This is by no means a bad way to analyze a character, but it just feels so lifeless? Like, surely there's something else, some other essence that makes a character special. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere weird with this because there isn't. However, the art of storytelling is creating the illusion that there's more. My proposition is that this illusion is ultimately what people cling to. Describing a character in terms of measurable factors such as motivation, place in the story, and character development, even if it covers every last element of storytelling and character writing present, will never fully encapsulate why a given character is liked. Like, okay, to try and get across what I mean, try and picture your best friend. Now try and describe them. Not just their appearance or a few basic traits, try and analyze them like you would a character. Assuming you know this person well enough, you can list their personality traits, how they've changed, how they refuse to play Yu-Gi-Oh! No matter how many times you refuse to untie them. The more you do this, however, the more wrong it feels, because none of that grasps why you're friends with them. And what you definitely wouldn't do is spend the whole time talking about what their growth as a person means and what role they play in the narrative of your lives. In the world inside your head, characters are your best friends. And the more you pretend they aren't, the more unnatural it feels. No matter how many words you attach to a description of a character, it will never encapsulate why someone likes them. If we accept that what people ultimately enjoy and remember is the world inside their minds, then it's probably better to analyze the underlying mechanisms that a story uses to create this illusion of its characters, rather than just analyzing and concluding if a character is good or not. Okay, now I'm done. Please let me know in the comments if you actually bought a single thing I said in this video. As I've said, I've been stewing on these vague thoughts for a while, so I made this video mostly to see if I was insane or not. Now see you in the next video where I break down the media analysis implications of the lizard octopi civilization that's been gang stalking me.